This is not the first media revolution we're living through, but arguably the digital transformation of higher education goes deeper than many of the media revolutions we've been witnessing, say, for the last 50 years. I'm a professor in southern Norway. My name is Oddgeir Tveiten. I'm a professor of media studies, and I am also a professor in journalism studies at an adjunct university close by. I have taught media studies at the University of Bergen before. I was a researcher at the University of Oslo, and I have my basic education postgraduate from the United States. My connection to EdTech is very simply put, I teach. So anybody who teaches today has a connection to EdTech, by definition. Education in Norway in general is a big topic. And I think one thing we can say is that it has many similarities to education in Finland and Sweden and Denmark, and Iceland for that matter. What strikes me as might be different in the Norwegian context is that compared, for instance, to a country like Finland, I think that we have had more of an integration with the English language culture for a longer period of time. So that might be one element of this. We have a system that's based on a public service idea, which is essentially the social democratic ideology in a way thinking penetrating through. Compared, for instance, to England and to the United States, you have a much more hierarchical system of education all the way down to kindergarten. And you go to the United States, for instance, you will see also that education in a way is segmented in terms of regions. The states are rather different. It's segmented in terms of social class, and you can always argue that education sort of, in a sense, deepens social class differences instead of alleviating them. And these questions are high on the ideological agenda, I think, in all the Nordic countries, that education is supposed to function in an equalizing manner. That to me would be a key, I think, to note. The other one is that if you take this and move it to higher education, we have some of the same. So for instance, in most of the Nordic countries today, we experience an influx of international students. For instance, students from the United States coming because there is no tuition. So the living costs might be high, but the tuition is low. So it changes, in a sense, the parameters in terms of how students move, the student mobility internationally. And in higher education in Norway, I think there is an ongoing process of connecting and standardizing to fit with an international mode of higher education, which is, for instance, seen in the way that we have appropriated the BA and the MA structure. And this is an ongoing process that most academics recognize. It has to do with standardization processes across Europe and also internationally. So from that point of view, I think our higher education system, just like our lower education system, stands out primarily in the sense that it's free and public service minded. We have a few private university colleges. Likely we'll have private universities also in the near future, but they are limited, and these are subject to rather strict political regulations. In terms of national strategies for uses of technology in higher education, I think the first thing to say is that we have one. There are many aspects of that, but you can point, for instance, to the way that our learning management system, the current one being Canvas, is kind of dominant throughout the country because there is a national policy behind the choosing of these learning management systems. And it's a mark in that in the future is likely to be rigidly policed by political, I think, sort of regulations and frames. So from that point of view, it's an ongoing discussion, an ongoing, I think, challenge from the point of view that the main threshold is to actually get in. I think in the Norwegian sense, meant to be a way of connecting universities. They're fairly small by international standards, and connecting the resources from a country with only 5 million population-wise, and making use of them in the most rational sense. So that would be one element of how this works out, I think, as a national sort of political framework in Norway. What I have in mind is that media studies internationally has tended to, since the beginning of that field, to think in terms of the effects of the media, to think in terms of the formats, the genres, the information flows that go through media. And education technology is media. So from that point of view, for me, it's kind of like a subfield in a way, a subdiscipline within the wider range of media studies. So that made sense. Finally, when I started to look at EdTech more in detail as a research endeavor, it was because I sensed that my own university was heavily impacted by these changes, and I started to question the way that we as a university met that challenge. I can tell you a little bit more about the Future Learning Lab and why we started it. By starting this as kind of a university initiative, it was really meant to build a conversation at our own university, having to do with a variety of issues and challenges that are coming on the table as a consequence of media changes. The first initiative there was essentially an invitation to all the faculties at the university to meet, and we had a 3-day workshop where we kind of tried to put up an agenda, created what's today a research center and also an international network. So the research center has people from 4 of the 6 faculties, and basically doing, I would say, fairly small projects together, because they would basically be internal projects. But many of the members of the research group also being parts of larger external or international projects. So we learn from each other, and we try to find ways of sharing the expert points of view that come from the research that we all do. I think a key focus also has been on the development of new education approaches, models, frameworks. So that's one part of it. Internationally, we have a network with a number of people from the United States, from other European countries, and in some ways a network that resembles yours in a kind of mandate or understanding of what the goal has been. But we have tried to maintain a network of people that meet and return together from the basis of having project interests together. Why did we start this up? I may be wrong, but my sense then and my sense still is that the big challenge for universities to accommodate new technologies is to understand the impact of technologies in a fundamental sense. We can talk about big data, we can talk about learning analytics, we can talk about innovations and entrepreneurship, but the question is essentially, what do we analyze? What do we innovate? What is the entrepreneurial activity based within? And for me, there is a ground vision of what higher education is in the first place. And I think that current technologies to some extent challenge us to rethink and certainly to consolidate between the various university sort of disciplines, faculties, sort of legacy, transitional sort of conversations that we've had before. This is not the first media revolution we're living through, but arguably the digital transformation of higher education goes deeper than many of the media revolutions we've been witnessing, say, for the last 50 years. So I think that we need to rethink in a way where we are, and my sense is that engineers, scholars in the humanities, scholars in pedagogy, scholars like, for instance, in my department of global development and planning, we think very differently and we assume a lot of things. And my sense is that getting deeper into those assumptions, that has something to do with letting the sociological imagination loose. Because if you can ask the fundamental questions in a contextual way, in a cultural sense, you can probably also get further along in terms of the solutions that you propose. So for me, these are deeply philosophical questions about what higher education is in the first place.